Your mom isn't my responsibility. The rain had just stopped when Naomi Whitaker walked into the kitchen and set a white envelope on the counter, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Caleb Harrington stood by the window with a glass of red wine in his hand, the kind of calm, unhurried calm that came from 8 years of believing he always had the upper hand in any room he entered. Naomi watched him glance at the envelope, the way a man might glance at a grocery list, mildly curious, mildly bored. She told him it was her mother's medical bill, that the treatment had gotten more expensive than anyone expected, and that she only needed his help for a few months while she figured out the rest. She was not asking him to carry the whole weight. She was asking him to share it. The way she believed a marriage was supposed to work, the way she had shared every weight he had ever handed her without complaint. Caleb set the wine glass down slowly, picked up the envelope, opened it, and read the number without any change in his expression. He did not ask how her mother was feeling. He did not ask what the doctors had said, or how long the treatment would last, or how Naomi had already been managing on her own for weeks while trying not to worry him. He simply folded the paper back into thirds, placed it on the counter, and said the words that would end the marriage long before either of them filed a single document. Your mom isn't my responsibility. He said it the way a man corrects a small mistake in an email, casual, factual, final, as if he were reminding her of a rule she should have already known. Naomi stood very still, looking at the man she had married 8 years earlier, looking at the wedding band on her own hand, feeling something inside her go quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. She reminded him, evenly, without raising her voice, of everything she had carried for his family over the years. When his mother needed the roof repaired, Naomi had wired the money without hesitation, without asking him to split it, without even mentioning it again once it was done. When his consulting firm nearly collapsed during a bad quarter, Naomi had drained her personal savings to keep it afloat, telling herself it was an investment in their future rather than a debt he owed her. When Evelyn Harrington needed surgery, Naomi had taken 3 weeks off work, unpaid, to sit in hospital corridors and hold a woman's hand who had never once called her by name without a faint edge of condescension. Caleb listened to all of it with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, and when she finished, he said only 2 words. That was different. Naomi asked him how, exactly, it was different, and he told her that her money had always been hers, but his money had always been his. That sentence told Naomi everything she needed to know about the architecture of her own marriage. It was not about the money at all, not really. It was about how Caleb had built a private ledger in his mind, where every sacrifice she made was simply what a wife was supposed to do, and every sacrifice he was asked to make was an imposition on a man who had never signed up for it. He wanted a partner when it served him, and a stranger's daughter when it did not. Naomi felt the old instinct rise in her, the instinct to argue, to remind him of every year, every dollar, every quiet act of devotion she had given this man, without ever once being asked to prove her loyalty in return. But something in her had already shifted, something that had been shifting slowly for longer than she wanted to admit. She looked at him and said only one word. Okay. Caleb exhaled, satisfied, already reaching for the wine glass again, already certain the conversation was finished and the matter closed. He had no idea that this single word would become the last thing he ever truly understood about his wife. He believed she had surrendered. He believed the woman who had spent 8 years absorbing his silences, his moods, his family's quiet insults, would simply absorb this one too, the way she always had. That night he went to bed early, satisfied with himself, while Naomi sat alone in the living room with the lights off, listening to the rain start again outside the window, listening to the house settle around her like something that no longer quite fit. She opened her phone and found a message, waiting from a name she had not expected to hear from that night. It was from her attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Vivian Cross, and it read simply that she needed to come in first thing in the morning because there was something her husband did not know. 8 years earlier, Naomi had walked into a downtown finance conference wearing a blue dress she almost didn't buy, and had met a tall, confident man named Caleb Harrington, who seemed to know exactly what he wanted from every room he entered. At the time, Naomi already had her own career in corporate communications and a modest inheritance from her father, a quiet, steady man named Samuel Whitaker, who had built a small but respected logistics business before he passed away. Caleb was charming in the way successful men often are, generous with compliments, quick with plans, certain of his own trajectory, and Naomi had found herself drawn to that certainty after years of building her own life through careful, unglamorous work. Within a year they were married, and for a while the marriage looked exactly like the life Naomi had imagined for herself, full of dinners with new friends and long weekend drives and a shared apartment that felt, for a time, like something they were building together. Caleb liked to say the two of them were a team, and in those early years, Naomi believed him completely, repeated it to her mother on the phone, repeated it to herself when things got hard. But teams, Naomi would later realize, require both players to actually share the ball. Slowly, without ever announcing it, Caleb began making the larger decisions alone, deciding where they would live, how they would invest, which family obligations mattered and which did not, and Naomi found herself agreeing more often than deciding. When money came in, it was framed as his success, his hustle, his vision, even when Naomi's own salary had covered the gaps during his leaner years. When Naomi succeeded in her own career, earning a promotion or landing a difficult client, Caleb would smile and say, "Of course, we're married," as though her achievements were simply extensions of his household rather than victories that belonged to her alone. It took years for Naomi to notice the pattern clearly, because it never arrived all at once. It arrived in small erosions, in the way credit shifted toward him and burden shifted toward her, until one day she realized the marriage had quietly become something closer to a hierarchy than a partnership. And she had been living inside it so long, she had stopped noticing the walls. There were financial documents, too, that Naomi had signed over the years simply because she trusted the man she married, documents she had barely glanced at because glancing at them had never once felt necessary. It was Vivian who eventually found the gaps, the places where full disclosure should have existed and did not. There was an investment company registered under a name that was not immediately recognizable as Caleb's, tucked inside a filing that looked, at first glance, like nothing more than routine paperwork. There was an asset account Naomi had never once been told about, holding a balance far larger than either of their joint accounts combined. There were large sums of money that had moved between accounts in patterns that made no obvious sense for a household budget. Transfers timed too precisely, amounts too specific, to be accidental. Naomi began to notice, and once she began, she could not stop. She noticed who called Caleb late at night, and how he would step into another room to take those calls, his voice dropping to a register she rarely heard him use with her anymore. She noticed that the small safe in his home office was locked at all hours, even when he wasn't home, something that had never seemed necessary in the earlier years of their marriage, back when he used to leave everything open, when there had been nothing between them worth locking away. She noticed how tense he became whenever she brought up long-term financial planning, how the conversation always drifted somewhere else before any real answers arrived, redirected with a joke or a change of subject he thought she wouldn't catch. And she noticed, most unsettling of all, that Evelyn Harrington always seemed to know about family financial matters before Naomi did, as though information flowed freely between mother and son, while Naomi remained politely outside the circle, smiled at, included at dinners, but never truly told anything. One evening, while charging her own phone from Caleb's charger, a photo notification appeared on his screen for a fraction of a second before disappearing. It showed Caleb shaking hands with a man Naomi had never met, smiling for the camera, and she would later learn that man was the director of a company she herself had once helped fund with money from her father's estate. The next morning, Naomi drove to the hospital to see her mother, and Lorraine Whitaker did not ask a single question about Caleb. She only asked how Naomi herself was doing, her voice soft but her eyes sharp, missing nothing the way they never had. Something about the simplicity of that question broke through the composure Naomi had been holding onto for days, and she sat by her mother's bed and told her everything. The bill, the kitchen, the two words that had landed like a verdict she hadn't been given the chance to appeal. Lorraine listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable in the way it had always been unreadable when she was quietly furious underneath a calm surface. When Naomi finished speaking, Lorraine told her, gently but firmly, that she should never let a man make her feel she needed permission to take care of her own mother, that love did not require asking for it in installments. Naomi cried then, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and Lorraine simply let her, holding her daughter's hand the way she had when Naomi was small. Lorraine admitted something she had never said aloud before that day. She had never fully trusted Caleb, not from the very beginning, and it had nothing to do with the color of his skin or the size of his bank account. Nothing to do with anything so simple. It was something in the way he looked at Naomi, something Lorraine had recognized from a lifetime of watching men move through the world with a certain kind of hunger disguised as affection. He did not look at her daughter as someone to build a life alongside. He looked at her as something to be managed, something to be owned through, a resource dressed up carefully as a partner. Men like him, Lorraine said, don't ask what they can build with you. They ask what they can own through you. Naomi would carry that sentence with her for the rest of the story that was about to unfold, would hear it again in quiet moments for months afterward. Then Lorraine told her something that changed the shape of everything that followed. She revealed that she had been holding on to a set of documents belonging to Naomi's late father, papers Naomi had never fully understood as a young woman grieving her loss and eager back then to simply move forward with her life. The inheritance Naomi believed to be modest was, in fact, structured far more broadly than she had ever realized, spread across accounts and holdings. Her father had quietly built over decades of careful, unglamorous work, the kind of wealth that never announced itself loudly. Naomi had always been the primary beneficiary, though she had never had reason to look closely at what that truly meant until now, until this moment, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed. And buried somewhere inside Caleb's business, in assets he proudly called the fruits of his own labor, there might be threads leading directly back to money that had never belonged to him at all. Lorraine told her daughter she needed to see a lawyer, not because of divorce, but because Naomi might have spent years without ever knowing exactly how much she actually owned, and how much of what Caleb called his had quietly begun with her. Vivian Cross did not offer comfort when Naomi arrived at her office the next morning, and Naomi found she did not want comfort anyway. Vivian offered documents instead, spread across the desk in neat, damning rows, bank statements and contracts and wire transfer histories that told a story far more complicated than anything Naomi had imagined, sitting alone in her living room the night before. Vivian told her plainly that her marriage was not what she believed it to be, and the sentence landed with a weight that seemed to press the air out of the room. Somewhere in the paper trail, money that had originated from Naomi's own investments had been funneled into a separate company entirely under Caleb's control, and more troubling still, legal structures had been quietly built around those assets, structures Naomi had never been properly informed of or asked to approve. When Naomi asked whether Caleb had simply taken her money, Vivian corrected her carefully, choosing each word. "Not exactly," she said. "He built a wall around it so you couldn't easily reach it." The why became clear soon enough, laid out across another set of documents Vivian had pulled together with quiet, methodical patience. Caleb's firm had been quietly struggling for well over a year. A major deal had collapsed months earlier without ever becoming public knowledge, and a hidden debt had been growing beneath the surface of a business he presented publicly as thriving, as unstoppable. If Naomi had known the full truth about her own assets, she might have moved to protect them long before Caleb needed to use them to keep his company from collapsing entirely. Even more unsettling was the discovery of Evelyn's name scattered throughout several of the documents, suggesting the older woman was not simply aware of what her son was doing, but had actively assisted him in concealing it, perhaps even suggesting some of it herself. Naomi sat across from Vivian, absorbing the shape of a betrayal that stretched back years, one that had never announced itself with shouting or scandal, only with silence, and locked drawers, and careful paperwork designed never to be questioned by anyone, least of all the woman whose name and money had made so much of it possible. There was more, too, details that took shape slowly over the following days, as Vivian's team continued digging through years of records. A holding company registered in a neighboring state carried Caleb's initials disguised inside a longer, unfamiliar name. And inside that company sat a portfolio of investments that had grown quietly for years without ever appearing on a single joint tax return. The two of them had signed together. A property near the coast, purchased under a trust Naomi had never heard mentioned in 8 years of marriage, sat empty most months, maintained by a management company that billed a separate account entirely. When Vivian asked how long this pattern had likely been running, her investigator estimated somewhere close to 5 years, meaning Caleb had begun building this second, private financial life, not long after the early promises of partnership had started to fade in practice, if not in words. Naomi listened to all of it without interrupting, the way her mother had taught her to listen when something mattered enough to get right the first time. Vivian slid one final document across the table and told Naomi that her husband had not simply been hiding money. He had been preparing for the possibility that the marriage would end and structuring things so that if it did, the financial fallout would land almost entirely on her rather than on him. Naomi looked down at the page and saw her own name printed neatly at the bottom, and beside it her own signature, given years earlier in good faith to a man she had trusted completely, back when she still believed his promises were built on something real. In that moment, something inside Naomi did not break the way it might have a year earlier. It sharpened, quietly and completely, into something she would need in the months ahead. She did not confront Caleb that evening. She drove home, cooked dinner, made ordinary conversation, and smiled, in all the places a wife is expected to smile, holding the shape of the woman he thought he knew, even as something new began forming underneath it. Caleb, satisfied that the matter of her mother's bill had been closed for good, began treating her with an even more casual disregard than before, joking with friends over the phone that Naomi always came around eventually, that she never stayed upset for long, that she was easy that way. Naomi heard him say it through the wall one evening and felt nothing but a quiet, cold clarity settle over her, the last of any softness toward him hardening into resolve. She was not coming around. She was preparing. Over the following weeks, Naomi began separating her personal finances with quiet precision, opening new accounts under her own name alone, reviewing every document she could access, and backing up records before anything could conveniently disappear from a shared drive or a locked drawer. She hired an independent auditor to comb through years of statements, a careful man named Grant, who asked no personal questions and simply did his work. She returned to her father's old papers with fresh eyes, this time understanding exactly what she was looking at, tracing lines of ownership she had never once thought to question. She identified, piece by piece, which assets had existed before her marriage and therefore belonged to her regardless of what Caleb chose to claim, in whatever paperwork he had quietly filed. She was not doing any of this out of revenge, though she understood if others assumed she was. She was doing it because, for the first time in years, she wanted to know exactly what belonged to her and exactly what did not, and she was no longer willing to let someone else answer that question for her. One evening, Caleb handed her a stack of papers and asked her to sign a power of attorney, framing it as simple routine paperwork, nothing worth overthinking, the kind of thing he expected her to sign the way she had signed everything else over the years without a second glance. Naomi looked at the document for a long moment, then set it down without signing, aware of how strange the silence felt after so many years of automatic compliance. "I'll have my lawyer review it," she said, her voice even, almost pleasant, betraying nothing of what had changed inside her. Caleb's expression flickered, surprise breaking briefly through his usual composure, and he asked why on earth she would need a lawyer for something so small. Naomi looked at him directly, calm in a way that unsettled him more than any argument could have. "Because you told me my problems were mine," she said, and watched something behind his eyes recalculate. Later that night, while Naomi slept, or pretended to, Caleb quietly searched her laptop, finding nothing incriminating, unaware that every meaningful piece of evidence had already been secured somewhere far outside his reach, in Vivian's office, backed up twice over. Weeks later, Caleb hosted a large gathering at their home, filling the rooms with colleagues, old friends, business partners, and family. the kind of event designed to project effortless success to everyone who mattered to him professionally. Evelyn moved through the crowd, introducing Naomi with a practiced smile, telling guests how fortunate Naomi had been to end up with someone like Caleb, as though gratitude were the only appropriate response to 8 years of quiet erosion. Naomi smiled back and said nothing, holding her wine glass a little tighter than necessary. When someone politely asked how her mother was recovering, Caleb answered before Naomi could speak, informing the room casually that her mother's care was, of course, Naomi's responsibility and not his, delivering the line as though it were an ordinary, unremarkable fact rather than the wound it actually was. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone senses something has shifted beneath the surface of polite conversation. When a joke has landed somewhere, it was never meant to be a joke at all. Naomi did not raise her voice. She simply asked Caleb whether he truly wanted to have this conversation here, in front of everyone he had spent years trying to impress, her tone light but unmistakably deliberate. He laughed, waving a hand, asking why not, clearly believing he still held every advantage in the room, still certain the ground beneath him was as solid as it had always been. Naomi did not reveal everything she knew that night. She offered only a single sentence, delivered with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed restraint far longer than anyone in that room could imagine. Then, perhaps, she said, we should also discuss which assets actually belong to whom. Caleb's confident expression cracked for the first time all evening, and across the room, Evelyn's eyes moved sharply toward her son, some old private understanding passing quickly between them. As the tension settled over the gathering, a man named Malcolm Reed stepped quietly through the front door, carrying a folder under one arm, arriving exactly when Naomi had asked him to, though no one else in the room knew that. Malcolm had once served as the family's trusted financial advisor, a man who understood the architecture of their combined finances better than almost anyone still standing in that room. He explained, calmly and without theatrics, that Caleb had once asked him to process certain transactions under Naomi's name, transactions Malcolm had refused to complete once he noticed irregularities that troubled him deeply enough to walk away from a lucrative client relationship entirely. Caleb's composure finally shattered, and he accused Naomi of orchestrating a public humiliation, his voice rising for the first time that evening. Naomi's response was quiet, but it landed with the force of something long overdue, something that had been building for 8 patient years. You didn't need my help embarrassing yourself, she said. You did that the night you told me my family didn't matter. Malcolm placed the folder in front of Caleb, suggesting gently that he should probably read it before his wife did, though the suggestion arrived far too late to matter. Naomi had already read it, days earlier, in Vivian's office, and she knew precisely what waited inside those pages, a record of financial maneuvering, far larger and far more damning than anything Caleb's guests would ever suspect that evening, whispering to each other behind their glasses as they slowly began to leave. The party did not end quickly after Malcolm's arrival. Guests lingered in small, uneasy clusters near the doorways, whispering behind cupped hands, unwilling to leave before they understood exactly what they had just witnessed, unwilling to stay long enough to be caught in whatever came next. Evelyn tried, briefly, to smooth things over with a joke about family dynamics and long marriages, but no one laughed, and she retreated toward the kitchen with her wine glass still nearly full. Caleb stood frozen near the fireplace, the folder Malcolm had handed him, still unopened in his hands, his eyes moving between Naomi and the small crowd that had, only an hour earlier, treated him like the most impressive man in the room. Naomi did not linger to watch him absorb it. She thanked her guests quietly, one by one, for coming, and let the evening end on its own, without her needing to orchestrate a single additional moment of it. In the days that followed, Naomi learned that money had never been the deepest layer of Caleb's betrayal, only the most visible one. He had, in fact, been quietly preparing for divorce for months before that kitchen conversation ever happened, hiring a private attorney whose name never appeared on any joint correspondence, opening a separate bank account under a variation of his name, even arranging a new apartment under an assumed lease that Vivian's investigator traced within days. And there was a woman, a colleague named Marissa Vale, who had entered Caleb's life sometime during the past year. Someone he had clearly grown far closer to than any professional relationship required. Someone whose name appeared in far too many calendar entries to be coincidence. What unsettled Naomi most was not simply the existence of the affair, painful as that discovery was, but the fact that Marissa seemed to know details about Naomi's inheritance and finances that no outside party should ever have been told. Details that could only have come from Caleb himself, shared in moments of intimacy, that should never have included financial secrets belonging to his wife. For the first time since this had all begun, Naomi allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, not the anger of betrayal, but the quieter, deeper grief of realizing the man she had protected and supported for 8 years had never been as loyal as she believed, not even in the ordinary, unremarkable ways she had simply assumed were true. It was not about losing him, not really. It was about the years spent building trust around someone who had been treating that trust as a resource to spend, rather than a bond to honor and protect in return. Lorraine, sitting beside her that evening in the small kitchen that had seen so much of this story unfold, told her softly that some betrayals arrive wearing the clothing of a blessing, ugly and painful in the moment, but revealing, in time, exactly what needed to be seen all along. Naomi did not ask why she hadn't been enough. She had stopped needing that question answered, had realized somewhere along the way that it had never been the right question to begin with. What she wanted instead was simpler and far more powerful. She did not need Caleb to regret losing her. She needed him to understand, finally and completely, that he had never truly owned her. Not long after, Vivian called with one more piece of the puzzle, her voice carrying the particular steadiness she used when the news mattered most. Caleb had claimed, in his own financial disclosures filed weeks earlier, that the majority of the couple's wealth had been generated during the marriage itself, positioning it as shared property, built through mutual effort and partnership. But the evidence Vivian's team had assembled told a very different story, one that traced significant portions of that wealth directly back to assets Naomi had brought into the marriage long before Caleb's name was ever attached to any of it. Naomi and Vivian built their case methodically, without theatrics, relying entirely on documentation rather than emotion, meeting twice a week in a small conference room lined with folders and highlighted printouts. Every transaction was traced back to its source. Every transfer was verified against dates, sources, and original ownership records, cross-checked against bank statements going back nearly a decade. Every contract was cross-referenced against Naomi's father's original estate documents, revealing a clear and undeniable trail that no amount of clever restructuring could fully obscure. The truth that emerged was simple and devastating for Caleb, laid out in a summary that ran nearly 40 pages long. He had used Naomi's money to rescue his company during its darkest financial period, quietly, without her knowledge or consent. And once the crisis passed, he had begun restructuring ownership to remove her name from the picture entirely. Without her, without the money she had contributed, and the sacrifices she had made without complaint for years, the empire Caleb liked to describe as entirely his own creation would never have survived long enough to exist in its current form. When Evelyn finally confronted Naomi directly, cornering her in a hallway outside Vivian's office one afternoon, she insisted, with the same practiced confidence she always carried, that her son had built everything himself, through nothing but his own talent and effort and years of hard work. Naomi asked her, simply and without malice, why then had he needed her money at all? Why had he needed to borrow from a woman he claimed contributed nothing of consequence? Evelyn had no answer, and for the first time in 8 years, the older woman's composure faltered completely, unable to meet Naomi's steady gaze in that narrow hallway. Caleb's arrogance, too, finally cracked under the weight of the evidence laid before him during a mediation session neither of them had wanted to attend. He asked, almost pleading, whether the two of them could still fix things between them, his voice smaller than Naomi had heard it in years, stripped of its usual certainty. Naomi reminded him gently of his own words, from that rainy evening in the kitchen, the ones that had started all of this months earlier. "You told me your money was yours," she said, watching him flinch slightly at the memory. He answered that he hadn't meant it, that it had been said in anger, without thinking, that he'd simply been frustrated about work that day. Naomi looked at him with something between sadness and certainty, something that had taken months to settle fully into place. "But I did mean it," she said, "when I chose to stop fighting for something that was never truly mine to save in the first place." Soon after, Vivian received formal confirmation that the court would review the full origin of the disputed assets, a development that shifted the entire balance of the case in Naomi's favor. Caleb understood, reading the notice in his attorney's office, that the outcome he had once assumed was guaranteed no longer belonged to him to control, that the walls he had built around Naomi's money had finally, inevitably, begun to come down. During the final negotiations, held across a long table in a downtown law office that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, Caleb made one last attempt to preserve what remained of his public image, offering Naomi a settlement in exchange for her silence, a quiet agreement that would keep the messier details of their marriage out of public record entirely. Naomi refused, calmly, without needing to consult anyone at the table beside her. She had no interest in being paid to disappear quietly, no interest in trading truth for comfort after everything it had cost her to reach it. What she wanted was simple and unshakable, something no amount of money could substitute for. She wanted the record to reflect exactly what had happened, without softening, without spin, without protecting the reputation of a man who had spent years protecting nothing but his own convenience at her expense. The mediation stretched across 3 long sessions, each one chipping away at the version of events Caleb's attorneys had tried to present at the outset, a version that grew thinner and less convincing with every document Vivian introduced. By the second session, Caleb's own lawyer had grown visibly cautious, advising quiet settlement over public trial, aware that a courtroom would only make the paper trail more permanent and more visible than either side wanted. Naomi sat through all of it without flinching, answering questions plainly, offering nothing beyond what was asked, letting the evidence do the work she had once tried to do herself with pleading and explanation. Vivian later told her that she had rarely seen a case turn so completely on documentation alone, without a single dramatic outburst needed to tip the balance toward the truth. In the end, the assets that had originated from Naomi's inheritance were formally recognized as belonging to her, separate and untouched by the marriage that had once tried to absorb them into someone else's name. Several of the more troubling transactions were placed under further review by the court, stripping Caleb of control over holdings he had long presented publicly as proof of his own singular success and vision. Evelyn, who had once introduced Naomi to strangers as a fortunate woman who had been lifted up by her son, could no longer meet Naomi's eyes in the hallways of the courthouse where the final hearings took place. Near the very end, standing in the emptying corridor outside the courtroom, Caleb asked Naomi one final question, his voice quieter than she had heard it in years, stripped down to something almost honest. After everything, he asked, how could she do this to him? Naomi paused before answering, choosing her words with the same calm precision she had carried through every difficult conversation of the past several months. "I'm not doing this to you," she told him. "I'm stopping you from doing this to me again." She walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, without triumph, without any need to celebrate loudly or prove a point to anyone watching from the steps outside. There was only a quiet, settled relief, the kind that comes after carrying something heavy for far too long and finally being allowed to set it down on solid ground. Her phone buzzed as she stepped into the afternoon light, a message from her mother telling her to come home, that dinner was waiting on the stove. Naomi smiled, realizing, perhaps for the first time in years, that the word home no longer carried any trace of Caleb inside it at all. Months passed, and Naomi devoted herself to helping her mother stabilize financially and recover fully, without turning any part of her newfound security into something showy or performative for anyone watching. She used a portion of the assets that had finally been recognized as her own to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting women, navigating financial abuse and inequality within their marriages, women who might otherwise have no idea how much had quietly been taken from them over the years. She named it the OK Foundation, not because she had grown fond of the word itself, but because that single syllable marked the exact moment she had stopped asking permission to protect herself and everyone she loved. Naomi built a new career from the ground up, one defined entirely by her own decisions rather than someone else's approval or convenience. She was no longer introduced as anyone's wife, no longer defined by a surname that had once made her feel smaller in rooms she should have owned completely on her own merit. She was simply Naomi Whittaker again, independent, composed, entirely in charge of her own direction for the first time in nearly a decade of quietly deferring to someone else's plans. The OK Foundation grew faster than Naomi expected, drawing in women from across the state who recognized pieces of their own lives in the story that had quietly circulated through legal and financial circles after the settlement became part of the public record. Naomi hired a small staff, mostly women who had lived through some version of what she had lived through, women who understood, without needing lengthy explanations, why a client might hesitate to open a bank statement in front of her own husband. She spoke at community centers and small conferences, never dramatizing what had happened to her, simply laying out the facts the way Vivian had once laid them out for her, calmly, clearly, without apology. Lorraine attended every event she could manage, sitting quietly near the back, watching her daughter speak with a pride she rarely put into words, but never failed to show on her face. Caleb's world, meanwhile, contracted sharply in the months that followed the settlement. The power and prestige he had once worn so easily began slipping away as the details of the case became known within his professional circles, colleagues growing quieter around him, invitations arriving less frequently than before. His relationship with Marissa did not survive the fallout either, ending not long after she realized the wealth and status she had been drawn to were far less substantial than Caleb had led her to believe during their time together. Eventually, Caleb reached out to Naomi one last time, not to fight, not to negotiate, but simply to apologize. Meeting her briefly at a quiet coffee shop, neither of them had ever been to together. He told her plainly that he had been wrong about all of it, about everything that had happened between them. Naomi looked at him and told him she already knew, without any need to make him say more than that. He asked, almost hesitantly, whether she ever missed what they once had together, watching her face carefully for any sign of softening. She considered the question honestly before answering, giving it the weight it deserved. "I miss who I thought you were," she told him, and there was no bitterness left in her voice when she said it, only a quiet, hard-earned peace that had taken nearly a year to build. That evening, Naomi returned home to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the same kind of quiet evening they had shared so many times before, though everything about their lives had changed since the last one that mattered most. Lorraine looked up and asked her daughter, simply, whether she was happy, the question landing gently in the small, warm kitchen. Naomi thought about the question for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the hesitation it once had, none of the old habit of checking whether her happiness was allowed. For the first time, she said, "I'm not asking whether I'm allowed to be." She walked into her office later that night and closed the door behind her, the quiet settling comfortably around her the way it never had before, back when every silence in that house had belonged to someone else. On the desk sat a small wooden sign, simple and unadorned, the kind of thing easily overlooked by anyone who had not lived through everything it represented. It read only a single line, one that had become truer to her, with every passing month since that rainy evening in the kitchen, when everything had quietly begun to change. "Okay is not surrender. Sometimes it's the beginning of freedom."